As a young boy growing up in rural Minnesota, the thing I dreaded most was my bus ride to school. It wasn't that I didn't like school. I really liked school. It was just getting there that was the problem. From the very moment I stepped on that bus, I realized that everyone around me, that my family was economically impoverished. I was the poor kid on the bus. Like it was yesterday, I remember comments made by fellow students on the bus. Comments like, "When are you going to paint your house? Who cut your hair? Why are you wearing that?" Comments like these brought misty tears to my eyes and deeply wounded my soul. Because economic impoverishment is worn on the sleeves, but it wounds the human soul. My mom, widowed young, with 7 children, did her best to survive economically. And she is one of my heroes. But I have to tell you that growing up in an economic impoverished family leaves lasting scars. The tragic irony is that our family was deeply involved in a faith community. And every Sunday we showed up at church. Everybody knew, it was obvious, that we had significant economic vulnerability. But I can't remember one time when members of our congregation reached out to assist us. And I don't think it was because they didn't care. I think rather, it was a just be faithful, pietistic paradigm that animated our thoughts about discipleship. Discipleship that was focused on Sunday, but not on Monday life and work and economic realities. My pastor was a good man, my congregation were great people, but they missed something really important. An important truth is that if we are going to be faithful, we must be fruitful. Because when our fruitfulness is lacking, our faithfulness is at risk. Jesus spoke a lot about fruitfulness, and it's not surprising. In the upper room discourse, Jesus tells us in John 15:6, "By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples." These words, fruitfulness, often bring to mind for many of us Paul's conversation about the fruit of the Spirit. What does it mean to be a fruitful person? Is it just love, patience, joy, peace? Is it just Christ-like character, as important as that is? But did Jesus have something more in mind about fruitfulness than mere Christ-like character, as important as that is? And I want to suggest to you this morning that Jesus' words in the Gospels, as well as the broader canonical landscape, give us 3 facets of fruitfulness that matter. The first facet of fruitfulness is relational intimacy. The second facet of fruitfulness is vocational productivity. And the third facet of fruitfulness is neighborly love. The first facet of fruitfulness, of bearing much fruit, is relational intimacy. Jesus, in the upper room discourse, connects 2 important words, abiding and fruit-bearing. Because when we abide in him, we have intimacy with him, and when we are intimate with him, we bear fruit for him. And Jesus modeled this, did he not? In his intimacy with the Father, he cultivated intimacy with the Father through the spiritual disciplines of fasting and prayer, of service, of solitude. And as apprentices of Jesus, we are invited into his pathway of transformation and intimacy with God through the spiritual disciplines of fasting and prayer and solitude. Spiritual disciplines are not meritorious, of course, but they lead us to greater intimacy relationally with God. The late Dallas Willard reminds us so well that spiritual disciplines are activities within our power in which we engage in order to accomplish what we cannot do by direct effort. Spiritual disciplines nurture our intimacy with God and bear much fruit for him. I've learned this in my relationship with Liz, my wonderful bride of 35 years. She's put up with me a long time. And in our relationship, we've had our ups and downs, but there's been a corollary. The deeper our intimacy, the more fruitfulness of our relationship and our entire lives. There's something about intimacy that deepens our relationship with God and others that leads to a true fruitful life. If I were to ask you, Are you bearing much fruit in your relational intimacy? What would you say? If Jesus were to look at your life and look at your intimate life, a relationship with him and others, would he say you're bearing much fruit? That is a very important question. And one of the ironies for Christian leaders and theologians and pastors and Christian business people is that we teach others about loving Jesus, and often we do not cultivate intimacy with Jesus ourselves. If Jesus were to look at your life and say, you're bearing much intimate fruit, would he say that? How would he rate you on that? Because at the heart of a fruitful life is an intimate life. All fruitfulness flows from intimacy. How are you doing in that? If Jesus looked at your life of intimacy, would he say, well done? The first facet of fruitfulness that Jesus has in mind is relational intimacy. But the second facet of fruitfulness is vocational productivity. It is vital for us to grasp that Jesus, in those hidden years of 30 years, 30 out of 33, Jesus spent as a carpenter, a business person, working with his hands, bearing much fruit in his vocational productivity, that Jesus would be concerned about fruitfulness of vocational productivity. This makes sense for us because in creation, human beings are created to be fruitful. And the Genesis account profoundly tells us that fruitfulness is at the heart of a human anthropology. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, we have 5 Hebrew imperatives that are linked together in a strong chain. These 5 Hebrew imperatives and the cultural mandate tell us that fruitfulness matters. The first Hebrew imperative is the Hebrew word para. It sets the trajectory of humans throughout all of the Bible to be fruitful. But what does fruitfulness mean? Fruitfulness has 2 nuances in the Hebrew text. All the way through the Bible, fruitfulness has a sense of procreativity and productivity. In procreativity, we understand that fruitfulness is about having babies. But the Genesis text is not just about having babies. It's also about being productive. Para is about fruitfulness of family life, but it's also about productivity. In Genesis chapter 1, the theme of fruitfulness builds. And what we see in Genesis chapter 2 is that Adam represents this fruitfulness of productivity. In Genesis 2, Adam is put in the garden to cultivate and to keep it. And Eve arrives on the scene as his helper, not just to have babies, but to be vocationally productive. And when we get to Genesis 3, we see how para is vandalized, just like shalom. In para, we see that there is now pain in childbirth. Procreativity is affected. But not only procreativity, productivity, because now there are thorns and thistles in the garden. The human fruitfulness that we were created to have is impacted by the fall into sin. And all the way through the Old Testament, we see how the importance of para and fruitfulness builds. One of the things that amazes me is that as the wisdom literature builds to the book of Proverbs, what we have is the embodiment of wisdom. And it's not in a priest, it's not in a king. It's a woman engaged in for-profit economic commerce. Proverbs 31 paints this wonderful picture of a wise and fruitful woman. And it ends with this statement, give her the fruit of her hands and let her work praise her in the gates. Isn't it amazing that the embodiment of wisdom is placed in a woman who's engaged in profit for commerce? Vocational productivity matters to a fruitful life. When I think of a vocationally productive person, I think of Liz Ann. Liz Ann is an amazing woman. She's an older single woman who's never had children, but she's an amazing productive person. During the week, she teaches at a local school district in Kansas City, and she teaches hearing impaired students, and she's brilliant at what she does. She is not paid a great amount of money. She doesn't have a prestigious job, but she's an amazingly vocationally productive apprentice of Jesus. And every Sunday I see her in the sound booth as a volunteer in our church, making sure everything is perfect. Liz Ann is an apprentice of Jesus who models profound relational intimacy and, yes, profound vocational productivity. How about you? If Jesus were to look at your life, would he say you're bearing much fruit in your vocational productivity? If Jesus were to give you your annual job review, how would it read? If Jesus were to give you a class or evaluate you as a teacher, what would he say? Because vocational productivity matters. It matters a great deal. When Jesus looks at your vocational productivity, whether it's paid or unpaid, would he say, well done? The third facet of fruitfulness is neighborly love. And Jesus again models this beautifully in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, Jesus teaches us about the great commandment to love God supremely and love others sacrificially. And Jesus embodies that in a story. We all know that story. It's a story of the Good Samaritan. In the story of the Good Samaritan, what we see is the Samaritan comes along by a road where a man is the victim of economic injustice. He is robbed and beaten and left dead by the road. And the Good Samaritan expresses Christ-like compassion, but he also expresses economic capacity. We often miss this because not only does he offer first aid, but he takes him to an inn and provides with his Visa card to cover his whole payment. And woven into Jesus' story is a truth we must not miss, that neighborly love involves compassion, but it also involves capacity. How was it possible for the Good Samaritan to have capacity to meet a neighbor's need? It was because he had been vocationally productive in an economic system in the first century that was monetized. And it was in that monetization that he was able to love his neighbor. How about you? Are you loving your neighbor? Dave Ramsey has taught thousands and thousands of Americans about the importance of financial capacity. In his Financial Peace University, he speaks about building margin in our life and economic capacity to help others. Not for an indulgent lifestyle, not for an over-indebted lifestyle, but margin and capacity to be a neighbor in need. And one thing that stuns me is that in his research, 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. What does that mean in terms of neighborly love? What that means is that many times we have the compassion, but we do not have the capacity to love our neighbor as we ought. How are you doing in that department? See, if we understand this, we really understand it. That if we have compassion without capacity, we have human frustration. Period. If we have capacity without compassion, we have human alienation. But if we have compassion and capacity, we have human transformation. And we have neighborly love. Neighborly love matters. A fruitful life is a relational, intimate life. It's a vocational, productive life. And it's a neighborly love life. Each morning, we wake up to an economic world. And while human capacity is more than economics, it's not less. Because most of us love our neighbor most in a global economy when we go to work every day that's monetized for the good of our neighbor. Imagine with me for a moment what it'd be like if we taught a more robust theology of fruitfulness. Imagine what it'd be like for an economy fueled by neighborly love, of innovation, creativity, wealth creation, and compassion. Imagine what it'd be like for faith communities to embrace a fruitfulness where the most vulnerable flourish in their cities. Karen showed up at our church one Sunday morning, a single mom with children broken at the end of her rope. She sat through the worship service, heard the gospel proclaimed, came back the next Sunday. She embraced the gospel, was baptized, and she joined a small group in our congregation. A small group that believed that fruitfulness mattered, that relational intimacy, vocational productivity, and neighborly love were a part of being a community. And they wrapped her in their arms. They loved her. They gave her job training. They paid her rent for 2 months. They nourished her. And when I see Karen on a Sunday morning now, I see an apprentice of Jesus who's bearing much fruit. She's able to provide for her family. She has a shout in her step. She's generous, and she's bearing much fruit. Imagine what it would have been like for my single-parent mom to be part of a community like that. Imagine what it would have been like for a young boy getting on a bus with a wounded soul. Imagine if he didn't have a wounded soul, but he had a joyful heart. Can we be faithful without being fruitful? Jesus says no. To be faithful, we must be fruitful. Fruitfulness of intimacy, productivity and neighborly love matter. Thank you.